Well, hello, everybody. I've gathered this group of merry fellows together to talk about Sedevacantism. If everybody wants to introduce themselves, I'll start first. I'm Serp Kerp.
Yep. I'm Terillian on Twitter. Yep.
Classical Theist. I have a Twitter account, and I also have a YouTube channel where I discuss Thomism and scholastic philosophy and things like that.
And it's awesome.
So we've gathered here to talk about Sedevacantism. Now, my main interests are probably church history and just history in general. So I'm going to, when I talk about this, I want to address that from this standpoint. And to start out, Sedevacantism is the belief that a pope can be deposed by a layman for manifest heresy. Would you guys agree with that?
I mean, you could argue it amounts to that.
I think one qualification I would make is that the Pope is, according to the theory, the Pope is deposed by himself, by his own manifest heresy.
Yes.
And then they always use the term that the deposition is ipso facto upon his formal heresy that is made manifest.
Yes. And it doesn't matter if he's not been rebuked by the cardinals or anything like that. He is
right.
This is a state that can be recognized by any layman.
It requires no formal admonition.
Yeah.
By the church. It's really us recognizing something that has already happened.
Yes. And contrary to popular opinion, Sedevacantism, even though it's associated with the popes after Vatican II, has existed as a theory. To the earliest I know of, the first Sedevacantist was actually William of Ockham, who declared Pontifex VIII to be
John the 22nd.
John the 22nd. Yeah.
It was John the 22nd? I thought he said Pontifex VIII because of his...
No. It was John the 22nd.
Okay. Anyway, so you have William of Ockham, and then you have Savonarola with Alexander VI.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's kind of, you go into the era of the Reformation or Counter-Reformation if you want, and there's a lot of pontificating upon what Sedevacantism is, what to do if there's a heretical pope, and so on. And then pretty much until then, you had kind of this theory of papal positivism where God would directly prevent anything remotely coming from there, that basically the Holy Ghost would protect at all times, even material history from happening.
And then material heresy.
Mm-hmm. And then you get to Vatican II, and you have the rise of the Sedevacantist maybe in the 1970s. The first Sedevacantist, I'm forgetting his name right now, was a Mexican bishop, or a Mexican priest who later became a bishop under the Took line. He declared Paul VI to be an anti-pope because of his perception of heresies in Vatican II. Even though John the 23rd has no reason to be called an anti-pope because he would have never promulgated heresy or been a manifest heretic in the eyes of Sedevacantists. They often say that he's an anti-pope due to his association with Vatican II. That's classical Sedevacantism. There's also Sede-privationism, which is that the popes of Vatican II on have the ability to become a pope if they repent of their heresy, and that they have the jurisdiction of a pope without having the teaching ability. Do you guys want to add anything to that? Am I defining it correctly?
That's pretty fair. Sede-privationism basically holds the current popes are potential pope. The current claimants to the papacy are potential popes and have the ecclesiastical jurisdiction, but not the fullness of teaching authority.
And they can. And I think it also means that their juridical acts are in themselves null and void. I could be getting that wrong, but that another crucial part of it would be that if they correct themselves, if they return to orthodoxy, I'm not sure how that would be established by the church or not. But if they do return to orthodoxy, then they, the office that they hold goes from potency back to act.
Yeah.
Or maybe to act for the very first time.
I've never been able to get Girard Deslauriers's papers on this to understand it exactly, but that's my understanding. It's very popular. But and then there's a third type of Sedevacantism, which doesn't where the defection of popes doesn't begin with Paul VI or John the 23rd. It begins with Francis, and it accepts Vatican II as valid, and then says Francis is so egregious break with tradition that he's lost the papacy. And properly speaking,
we're probably going to be seeing a lot more of that in the future.
Yeah, and to be fair, this is a difference between saying that Francis is an anti-pope, properly speaking, and Benedict XVI is still the pope, because Francis Sedevacantism would acknowledge that Francis lost his papacy through heresy, as opposed to never having it
Right.
from intimidation.
See, there are two strains of this, it seems. There are those who hold that line instead of Sedevacantism with respect to Francis. There are also people who will point to the what is that cardinal cabal? What do they call the
St. Gallen Mafia?
Right, yeah. That they think that their shenanigans in the papal election have invalidated it, or they believe that Benedict XVI. There's this one strange theory that's going around that Benedict XVI, since he did say something rather strange pertaining to his resignation, that he's going to give up the ministerial aspect of the papal office, as if it doesn't just give the whole thing away by its resignation alone, and that somehow invalidates the resignation itself. So he's still the pope, and so some of them go by the sort of what I might call the traditional Sedevacantist logic, which is that Francis, by heresy, has lost his office. But then there's also the people who say that
Austin.
It's either an invalid election or it was an invalid resignation, or something like that.
Invalid. So it would have to be an invalid resignation, because from my understanding, according to I mean, we can't know this for sure, but the reports of the voting would have, Francis wouldn't have been part of the St. Gallen Mafia.
Right.
And that so many people voted for him, if you counted all the people that were excommunicated, he still would have been elected anyway.
Yeah, I don't see that theory as having any legitimacy going for it. But
it's an interesting theory. But
yeah.
I haven't talked about this very much. It's kind of an interesting thing. When I had a reversion, or I became more faithful, it was exactly at the time when Francis was elected to the papacy. And it caused a massive crisis in faith, which resulted in me eventually frequenting Society of St. Pius V chapels for about 6 to 9 months, and I became a Sedevacantist.
Yeah.
Some personal issues happened there, and I was unable to go to Mass. And then I read a lot more about church history, and coming to the understanding of the authority, the question of authority with Sedevacantism caused me to abandon the position. And I eventually ascended. I eventually accepted Francis's validity as a pope.
Mind elaborating what you mean by the crisis of authority? I know what you mean, but for our viewers.
So if Francis appears to be a manifest heretic, what authority does a layman such as myself have to depope him?
Yeah. There's also the question of jurisdiction and the fact that under Sedevacantism, jurisdiction.
Oh, the extinction of jurisdiction. Well, here's another alternate thesis that's connected to Sedevacantism, which is commonly called homolonism. Since the Pope ceases to govern the church, you lose the ability to have jurisdiction. So you'd lose things like confession or the ability to say mass eventually, because all jurisdiction would eventually go extinct under the laws of the 1917 Code of Canon Law. And basically the entire church defects, leaving only lay people. That's called homolonism. And that there's no homolonism basically is kind of this very aggressive and like doom version of Sedevacantism,
It's
where
the
basically
doomer version.
It's the black pill Sedevacantism.
Yeah, it's a black pill Sedevacantism, and homolonism is usually contrasted against Sedevaprivationism, because Sedevaprivationism says that jurisdiction continues despite them losing their papacy.
Yeah. So basically, eventually, you wouldn't even have an ability to get a pope again because none of the cardinals would be valid. And it's the pope who determines who gets to.
In traditional Sedevacantism, but there's an alternate thesis in traditional Sedevacantism put forth by Griff Ruby that there's only one eternal diocese in a sense, or one eternal patriarchy, that which was established by Christ himself in Peter's form, so that when jurisdiction would go extinct, the only all bishops would essentially be auxiliary bishops of Rome, and then be able to elect a new pope.
Yeah, then there's the formal material hypothesis, which is related to Sedevacantism.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the argument that because the cardinals would be invalid, therefore you wouldn't have the ability to elect a pope, that they might get around that by just saying that, well, because that's impossible, we would just since cardinals are not essential to the deposit of faith, then we would just go down a level.
Well, when I asked the priest in the Society of St. Pius V, he said that his personal opinion was, I don't know. A lot of mystics talk about it getting so bad that Peter and Paul will come down from heaven and directly appoint someone. Yeah. That's actually a very common answer from.
Yeah, good luck with that.
Right, and it kind of has to be common.
I also asked Father Shikata, and he said Sedevacantism has no contradictions, so I believe it. We're just in a waiting position to see what happens, and he gave no ability to elect a pope.
Which is a problem, because Vatican I, and this is one thing that the conclavists, we can define conclavism in a second, but that they seem to have right, which is that the perpetual succession of the Petrine office is something that pertains to the faith. And if we lose the mechanism whereby that Petrine office retains its perpetual ability of succession, then that would seem to cut into the indefectibility of the church. I mean, Sedevaprivationists might be able to get around that in the sense that we always have the mechanism there at our disposal. But other than
there just needs to be some massive conversion to allow it to be used again.
Mm-hmm. So I think they might be able to deal with that, but I don't think many Sedes can really deal with that problem.
From my understanding, as we know, Pope Michael was elected out of a conclave of 6 people, including his mother and his father, as well as
you had a correspondence with him, didn't you?
I had a correspondence with a man who claimed to follow him.
Yeah.
I had a correspondence with Father Shikata and who claimed to follow.
And you could tell us about some of these in more detail. I think that would be...
Well, the guy who followed Pope Michael and knew him quite well, he said that Pope Michael believed in the concept of an imperfect conclave, which would basically mean that you would have, so there would be a conclave which would elect Pope Michael, and then what Pope Michael is trying to do essentially, and his followers, is trying to form a new conclave, which Pope Michael and other bishops will become members of, and that Pope Michael resign his papacy at the beginning of the conclave, and then the conclave will function. And the idea is that you would have a succession of conclaves until the entire Sedevacantist community would join the conclave or join the council, and it would be the same way that the three popes was ended. The Great Western Schism was ended through a succession of imperfect conclaves until the entire Sedevacantist community elects one pope, which they all follow. That's Pope Michael's theory, and that he would succeed in another conclave, whether he would be elected pope again or not. He doesn't care, but he would resign his own papacy and then vote in the conclave.
That's interesting.
What was the council that ended the Western Schism?
Constance.
So yeah, so a lot of conclavists that it would be essentially a repeat of Constance, and that all the claimants to the papacy would resign simultaneously, and that they would elect somebody that would be recognized by all the members of the conclave.
Of course, a major problem with that is there was an actual pope during Constance.
Yeah, you had Pope Martin V,
and he recognized it.
Yeah, he was the one who ratified the documents, so.
And he was very, very, very careful in the way he did so. Incidentally,
yeah, because he was very careful to avoid the conciliarism that was going on at the time.
Yeah.
Yeah,
well,
I don't think you had.
Sedevacantists will often point to. They often point to the Great Schism, Western Schism, as a very similar position.
Yeah, I just don't think it's that. It's really as analogous as they would want it to be.
There was still a pope who had a legitimate ability to appoint and recognize people as electors.
This wasn't like a 50-year interregnum that was that somehow created a council out of
bumbling around. A bunch of like lay people make a council with like a handful of
that's
priests and bishops that are carrying the Took line and stuff.
So I don't think it's an analogous situation.
One thing people will say is, the Pope has always been elected in a different way. We don't need cardinals. So it's like the Pope is the one who decides how the Pope is elected, ultimately. I mean, he's the one who establishes this sort of constitution. If there is no Pope, you can't change the method.
Right? If you follow the elections rules set up by Pius XII, then a new Pope is inelectable.
Yeah. You can't just revert to an older method because that was an older method and it would be convenient right now. You really can't do that. The Pope has already established how elections are going to work. Whoever you thought was the last Pope, and under that system, there's no way to re-elect the Pope.
I mean, at that point,
you create homo-lonerism and sit back and wait for the 3 days of darkness.
I mean, that's pretty much the only way you can. That's the only shot you have. But that also, as we discussed earlier, seems to contradict the
indefectibility.
Yeah, whoever would have the right to elect the Pope would then become the rock of the church, around which everything else is built.
Right, because Peter, the Petrine office, is the keystone of the apostolicity of the church. Yeah. And so we always need that an existing mechanism by which a pope is, in a sense, in the making. and that would be the interregnums. But the interregnums, the emergence of a pope, the potency for that is there. It's in the existing mechanism, so the keystone is still there. But
oftentimes they'll point to something is like, well, this is just the longest interregnum we've ever had. We had like a 4-year one before this during like the Diocletian persecutions, and it's just like, yeah, but jurisdiction didn't go extinct.
Yeah, I mean, what was the longest interregnum?
It's about 4 years, 3.5 years.
Yeah, I mean, it's not a situation where virtually every
person appointed by Pius XII at this point is dead.
Yeah. I mean, they can, I guess, for the sake of argument, posit the existence of some.
Well, here's the thing that happens. When you have if they're like thinking of a way to get out of this, the hypothesis is that there's Chinese bishops or like Chinese bishops behind the Iron Curtain, so to speak, that were allowed to act in secret with jurisdiction indefinitely.
No, see, what's gonna happen, Serp, is that there's this one last Chinese bishop who was appointed by Pius XII in some jail somewhere, and some Sedevacantist is going to go meet him and learn the ways of the Force. I mean, the ways of Catholicism from him, and then he's going to, become empowered, and he's going to lead a Catholic rebellion in China. And then he's going to become, the successor to the Petrine office, and he's going to take over China and he's going to merge the office of Huangdi with the office of Pope.
He will be the great monarch and the angelic pope simultaneously.
He'll be the Kwisatz Haderach. And how can this be? For he is the Kaiser Pope.
Yeah, pretty much.
I'm sorry for being flippant.
That wouldn't surprise me. Like if you proposed that to some of them, then they would probably give that serious consideration.
Yeah. Well,
I want to talk about Archbishop Took.
Yeah, you mentioned it. It'd be really good to go into what we mean by a Took line.
Okay, so the thing with Sedevacantism is there are two lines of bishops that come in the Sedevacantism. There's the line created by Bishop Took, and who's the guy that ordained Clarence Kelly? I'm trying to find his name. Mendez Gonzalez line in the Society of St. Pius V, which are not. Here's a massive problem in Sedevacantism is that the church has no philosophy in the sense that it's not one church; it's a visible body. If the Society of St. Pius V isn't in communion with the Took line bishops and vice versa, then how can this truly be a Catholic? The two lines of episcopal consecration are not in communion with each other.
Right. You would then have to sort of, in order to bind them together, you would kind of have to borrow the ecclesiology of the Orthodox.
Yes. So far, I speculate in the history of Nazism. But as now, there's just a bunch of bishops that aren't necessarily in communion with each other running around, or in an extremely loose communion. This is why they often try to make holy orders, such as the Society of St. Pius V, or the Congregation of Mary, the CMRI. Do you guys remember what it is?
Congregation of Mary Immaculate Queen.
Yes, and those are the two major ones in the United States. There's one in Mexico and one centered in Belgium as well. But getting back to what I was talking about, the main line of consecrations comes from Archbishop Took, which was he was Archbishop of Wei City,
Vietnam, who got exiled after his brother, the president of Vietnam, was assassinated in the early stage of the Vietnam War, and he was left in exile. During Vatican II itself, he implied, would it be possible for East Asians to receive communion using chopsticks? He posited that.
He was a weird dude.
Yes. After the Second Vatican Council ended in his exile, he consecrated 10 men, including 5 of the Palmer de Troyes Conclavis cult, and 3 Sedevacantists and 2 Old Catholics, one of which, from my understanding, became a Satanist.
Mm-hmm.
Wait, what?
Yeah. So during this time, he consecrated these 10 men to being bishops. He was excommunicated multiple times. He seemed to adhere to Vatican II and then apologize for consecrating bishops. And according to many eyewitnesses, he likely had dementia at the time, and that he had dementia and he was in poverty as a man in exile, so that people would approach him and then pay them money for him to consecrate them.
So it's basically simony.
Yes, it's accused by the Society of St. Pius V to be simony. And then the Society of St. Pius V with the Mendez Gonzalez consecration. The Father Shikata and those who left the Society of St. Pius V accused the Society of St. Pius V of abusing a man who had dementia as well, and then forcing him to consecrate Bishop Kelly into a bishop.
Mm-hmm.
Again, this doesn't necessarily mean that the Vatican recognizes the Took line because it recognized a priest which was consecrated with him without papal orders as a valid priest, meaning that the Vatican likely recognizes the validity of the Took consecrations. That doesn't mean that they're invalid, but again, if you're to ask yourself, why would Christ choose to save his church with a man with dementia?
Yeah, and not only that, but just also
a scandal involved.
Yeah. I mean, not only with dementia, but the fact that through manipulation of dementia.
Again, this is hearsay.
Yeah.
But I would say as a historian, it leans strongly towards he had dementia. During the consecration of Bishop Laurier, he, according to eyewitness reports, he said John Paul II was the Pope, and he invoked John Paul II's name during the consecration.
Mm-hmm.
Which would imply that he wasn't a Sedevacantist.
Yeah, I mean, and right.
That is so weird.
Which is obviously, if he wasn't a Sedevacantist, it's in complete contradiction to the whole circumstance of his consecrations, which probably is further evidence of his dementia.
Yeah.
So
the very fact that he consecrated a conclavis cult, Palmer de Troyes.
Yeah, the Palmarians.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
We should talk about them.
I just want to finish up talking about this.
Please do.
When I was a Sedevacantist, I was immensely troubled by this. This would be like Joseph Smith's wife burned a piece of scripture, and Joseph Smith just said, "It's lost forever," type of tier of like. And I asked Father Shikata in the correspondence, how do I deal with this? If God is going to save his church through the consecrations of this man, shouldn't I see clear providence here? And he just said, it's valid. That's all I care about.
Mm-hmm.
He won't defend the, how would you say, like, the looks of it, how good it looks. He just defends his
The optics.
Yes, he doesn't defend any of the optics. He just says it's valid. That's all that matters for me.
Which I think this does bring up an important topic. They believe that the new rite of ordination is invalid. And I think that is important to address because it's based on a misquote of the rite of ordination that very few people bothered to ever double check.
Even
Yes.
Father Chicago.
So, yeah, people look at Father Shikata's writing. I think it's called Absolutely Null and Utterly Void, which is his paper claiming that the episcopal consecrations after the council are invalid, as well as the priestly consecrations.
And that's basically a sort of a play on words from Leo XIII's encyclical, which dealt with Anglican order. So he's basically trying to say that the Novus Ordo ordinations is just we treat them exactly how we would the Anglican rite. But yeah, go ahead.
Yes, exactly. From my understanding, Father Shikata has this, and the group of whatever you want to call it, those centered around Bishop Dolan, use this understanding of Umma Cum. And this is a very, very controversial thesis within the Sedevacantist community, which is that it's a mortal sin to go to a non-Sedevacantist mass if it's valid.
Right.
Because you're adhering to a heretic being the true pope.
Yeah, you're basically being schismatic.
Because most lay Sedevacantists go either, including the brother Peter and Michael Diamond, go to the Society of St. Pius X or Eastern Rite, Catholic Eastern Rite masses to receive communion and absolution. But if Una Cum and the idea that you're saying that you're in faith with a heretic by engaging in those masses is true, then that would mean that almost everybody that's unable, meaning everybody outside of the United States and Mexico, in Mexico, I mean, it's very dangerous to travel there too, right? So you can't reach them.
Mm-hmm.
It's essentially completely impossible for them to receive the sacraments.
Right.
Which, it's a very bad thing because isn't there a history of people that followed the Diamond Brothers and then went insane, basically?
Yes.
Yes. There's one man in particular. He goes by the name of Richard E. Brawny. And I don't know too much about his personal interactions with the Most Holy Family Monastery, but he was definitely part of them for a while, and he eventually started to draw all sorts of implications from the Sedevacantist position. One of his main key ideas is that it doesn't really matter whether or not one's heresy is manifest or interior, because it has the same effect. And that effect is that it severs you from the unity of the church. And because it severs you from the unity of the church, well, then you have no competency, no ability, no means by which you can govern the church. So he took that principle and he did his own independent look into history. Because, to an extent, it's almost a result of laziness that so many Sedevacantists, they are assured that the buck stops at Pius XII. Well, who decided that? They basically look at the Second Vatican Council, and they say, okay, well that's the start of all this officialized modernism. But
if you look deeper into the church history of the 20th century, you'll realize it actually more off starts with Pius XII. Most of the stuff that happened in Vatican II can be traced back to Pius XII.
You can even trace it back to Pius IX and this is it, and I don't agree with them on this, but if you take their kind of radical view on extra ecclesiam nulla salus that most of them seem to take.
Not
Pius,
most.
well,
Most of the
No,
internet.
that's not true. The Sedevacantism and Fenianism do not match. When you create Sedevacantism and have Fenianism simultaneously, automatically forms a cult. Every time it's ever happened with the Diamond Brothers, for instance, and there's like a church in Kentucky with Took bishops or something. It automatically creates a cult if you mix Fenianism with Sedevacantism, and it's observed that whenever you have the two intermingle, it creates a cult.
Yeah, well, it makes perfect sense, because if Sedevacantism is true, then the visible church is basically destroyed. And since Fenianism is the belief that you need, well, radical Fenianism at least is the idea that you need to be a member of the visible church to be saved, well, the only way you can cope with that as a Sedevacantist is to be like, for some reason, by some special charism, we're the visible church, and it's obvious that we're the visible church, and you're evil.
Yeah. So
You're
anyway,
a filthy mortal sinner.
Well, if you go to the Brother Diamond's channel, the Diamond Brothers channel, there's a cacophony, this massive list of videos of traditional Catholics saying they believe in baptism of desire, and then the Diamond Brothers saying these are manifest heretics.
yeah.
So it'll have the entire Society of St. Pius V, the Society of St. Pius X, the Congregation of Mary the Immaculate Queen, Father Cicada, Bishop Sanborn, Bishop Dolan. All these people in the Diamond Brothers have declared them manifest heretics because they accept baptism of desire, or they hold to baptism of desire.
Okay.
Which, funny enough, Sir, you're like yourself.
I tend towards
but how many
more
of them?
mild
How
version.
many of them accept invincible ignorance? Because that's
Bishop
what
Sanborn accepts invincible ignorance, and he said it. I remember in a Q&A, a Sedevacantist layman asked him. He said, He said the Society of St. Pius X is heretical because they have this concept of invincible ignorance. And then Bishop Sanborn said, no, they're right, but there is invincible ignorance.
Okay. Well, but anyway, so my only point was that Richard E. Bronny saw no reason to stop the buck at Pius XII, so he did his own independent dig into church history, and according to his wherewithal, he in his unmatched wisdom decided that the buck stopped at Innocent II.
Yes, because he didn't believe
one
that
of the major
burned in hell.
one of his major reasons for that was that he sees scholasticism as a heresy. And not only scholasticism, but he after the High Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, he also saw the inclusion of humanist and pagan art as evidence of interior apostasy on part of the popes. So anyway,
there's another part, which is Innocent II, or at least people around that time, held to the concept of limbo, the limbo of infants.
Yeah, that's an important part of it. He's basically would describe himself as this radical Augustinian with respect to original sin.
Which, incidentally, if you check the Catholic Encyclopedia, that's actually an innovative position.
Right.
Augustine was an innovator with respect to original sin. Well, with respect to unbaptized babies, suffering pain of sense in hell.
Yeah. So he sees the discussion of limbo as also heretical, and so therefore he rejects as illegitimate, null and void, the entire visible structure of the church from the Middle Ages onward. And we can obviously say that that is obviously very wacky. He's himself a bit insane. He even says that he would like to see Thomas Aquinas roasting in hell,
He said
rotisserie
he would
style.
like to have him revived so that
Doesn't
he
it
could
claim
skin
that
him
like some of the
himself.
church fathers of late iniquity are anti-fathers?
Yeah, he
Yes,
says Jerome is an
Jerome.
anti according to him.
What?
Yeah.
Yes.
If Jerome is an anti-father, wouldn't that mean that the church defected when it accepted the Vulgate?
I don't know if that's why he says he's an anti-father. I don't know what his reasoning for that is, but the point here is though, within, and this is something we might talk about in a few minutes. What allows him, what gives him license to go back into church history through the centuries to after the fact to depose various popes, multiple popes, is the principle within, we could say, traditional Sedevacantism that the Pope, upon committing formal heresy, ipso facto loses his office, and that can give one great elastic license and freedom to look into church history, and certainly by the standards of many Sedevacantists today, by which they deem the past popes as illegitimate. Those are not rigorous standards that they use. They're not using very rigorous standards.
Bishop Sanborn, when asked directly what made John the 23rd a non-pope, he just said he was a Freemason.
Exactly. So like these are not rigorous standards. These are not
That's hearsay, conspiratorial hearsay.
exactly. So like that's those standards are not standards the church has ever used to declare someone a heretic. Okay, they would often they would speak of people who we today would see, well, obviously they were a heretic. For a long time they were called suspected of heresy. Okay, the church was very careful. The church was very rigorous in the process of determining whether or not someone was a heretic, and the charity that the church used far exceeds what many Sedevacantists today will render to these popes. So anyway,
prior to the Council of Chalcedon, the Monophysitists wanted the papacy to declare people they suspected Nestorianism who already died of declaring them manifest heretics. The papacy refused because it said that this would be against justice to declare somebody who died in full communion a heretic.
Right. Yeah. Another issue
Anti-fodder.
with this problem with this principle that the Pope loses his office automatically, and this is something that John of St. Thomas points to, is the case of one second here, Pope Marcellinus.
Yes, that's the case that caused me to abandon Sedevacantism, was Marcellinus.
Yeah, because Marcellinus, as we know, as at least many of us know,
Committed apostasy or an
under
act of
duress.
apostasy.
And he was, we should say, he was third century Pope. He committed actual, and this is documented history. He committed actual apostasy under duress, and then he came back. Now, no one would have said that he lost his office during that apostasy. That's never been said. His papacy was recognized all throughout his pontificate. And so now, if you're a Sedevacanist, maybe you have a way to go to sort of get around that. Well, like it's sort of like an off and on switch, right? When he committed apostasy, the light bulb of his active papal office was turned off, and then when he came, when he repented, then the light switch was turned back on. But most other Sedevacantists who were not Sedeprivationists, I don't think they have really a way to get around that, because once you lose your office, you lose your office. I don't think he could have gotten it back by repenting.
And there's no one that can bring him back because there's no pope to accept him back after him.
Right.
Yeah.
So I think that's a huge problem. if we want to even go more crazier than Ibrani, we could go back to the 3rd century.
You can depose Linus
Mm-hmm.
and Clement.
Oh, are you talking about because of Peter?
Yeah, you can depose everyone but Peter. And if you do, right?
Funny enough, I've met Protestants who hold to that position.
Really?
Yes.
Interesting.
I think it's more of a troll against like radical traditionalist Catholics.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it was by a certain Chinese Protestant that we're familiar with. So,
Okay, yeah.
if you know what I
I know
mean.
who you're talking about.
Yeah, I'm sure you know too.
So, Serp, if you want to talk a little bit more about your own experience with the Marcellinus case, about how that caused you to.
Well, if you go back and you read, say, prior to the donation of Pippin, and
Mhm.
read church history between the apostolic times and the donation of Pippin and the stability of the papacy, and the magnitude of the persecutions, the magnitude of the crisis, of the Christological crises, and stuff like Marcellinus, it puts the modernist crisis into a perspective that's not possible if you're only familiar with something like the Reformation or like medieval church history.
Right.
I mean, as we know, half of
Familiar
all
with late iniquity kind of makes Francis becomes much more similar to Honorius or Liberius. It's
Right.
much easier to understand Francis's power and his abilities if you understand who Honorius was, or who Liberius was, or who Marcellinus was.
So, I don't know if this is a good time to bring this up, but many Sedevacantists operate from a very expansive conception of papal
Yeah, let's
infallibility.
talk about that a bit.
Oh,
And
the Ultramontane.
I'm gonna
how
do a YouTube
about I
video on
start
that.
by looking at well, ultramontanist is actually not the correct word for that. Argent actually came up with the term papal positivist, and I
Yeah.
think that's a better one. Ultramontanism traditionally actually refers to the Pope's ordinary universal it refers to his universal immediate jurisdiction over the church.
Yeah, to an extent, we are ultramontan.
Yeah, because we believe in his immediate jurisdiction.
Yeah.
Would it be all right if I started by reading what Ludwig Ott has to say about this? I have it right
I
next to
think
me.
what might be a little bit better before Ott is if we read the canon, Vatican I.
From Vatican I. Yeah.
Let me get that up.
Because a lot of people, they don't read Vatican I.
So just to as a preface, what he's saying is that Sedevacantism and papal positivism today, which is kind of manifested people who very obedient to Pope Benedict and have remained obedient to Pope Francis, which has therefore caused a shift in their own ideology, where they went from conservative Catholics to now liberal Catholics, and it's only because of the papacy. So they're papal positivists because of the shift in ideology from the papal chair, they have therefore shifted their ideology. And it's because they have this highly exalted and expansive view of the infallibility of the Pope. So that's on one end. The other end would be the Sedevacantists who say, well, because papal infallibility is so expansive,
he mustn't be Pope.
The only way we can make sense of the last half century of the church is if these were just not popes.
Yeah.
Because of their liberalized papal teaching.
Yeah.
Okay, let me If you have it before me, you can just read it, but...
This is good radio.
What was that?
This is good radio. Page flipping sounds.
Oh yeah. Da, 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 da.
Okay, I think I got it. Well, I have the general section. Okay, the infallibility. Okay, here it is. Here it is. I got it. All right, so this is the Vatican I's scope of papal infallibility. Okay, quote. That the Roman pontiff, when he speaks ex cathedra, that is, when acting in his office of shepherd and teacher of all Christians, he defines, by virtue of his supreme apostolic authority, a doctrine concerning faith or morals to be held by the universal church, possesses through the divine assistance promised to him in Blessed Peter, the infallibility with which the divine Redeemer willed his church to be endowed in defining the doctrine concerning faith or morals, and that such definitions of the Roman pontiff are therefore irreformable of themselves, not because of the consent of the church. Okay, so we have the criteria there, so we want to sort of isolate them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So defines a doctrine. In Latin, the etymology of define is to set within boundaries. De finis, down from boundaries. So it means to clearly bind and carefully delineate. Okay. To be held, and
That's
as
a very
something
important one.
to be held by the whole church. He can't merely be saying, you know, most encyclicals would not fall under infallibility because there is no explicit requirement that one hold it. Now, there is a requirement, and we'll get to this later perhaps, that one be submissive to it in a way that, which it's kind of hard to explain what submission of intellect and will entails, but it's not the same as holding something.
Yeah, because
Definitively.
when you're merely submitting to something by intellect and will, you're recognizing implicitly the possibility of error.
Yes, and as the canon law, for instance, in fact, the submission of intellect and will canon is a post-Vatican II canon, which it's not absolute, so you are able to bring up concerns about
Because
the
if there's
form or even the
weightier-
content of it.
If there's weightier tradition that comes before that, and weight would be determined by the degree to which the Pope is expressing his desire that it be believed. I mean, it doesn't have to be held to an infallible standard necessarily, but I mean, let's just say, for example, you have Pius IX's syllabus of errors. Now, I wouldn't necessarily say that those are infallible because you don't have a theological censure attached, and the censure applies differently depending on which error you're talking about, and he doesn't necessarily.
Yes.
He doesn't go into which ones apply to which. But by its very nature, what he's doing is he's condemning errors. Okay.
Yes.
And in that, so that has a weight that's above Pope Francis changing the catechism, because the catechism, by its very nature, is an instructional compendium that houses the data points of tradition.
Yeah. It's only as authoritative as its sources.
Exactly. And that compendium is not itself a data point of tradition. Catechisms have never been looked at that way.
Nor is it explicitly binding on the whole church. And
Right.
I mean, some have said, well, why would it have to be explicitly binding? I mean, he's talking to the whole church. What could he want to do except bind people? Absolutely. It's, I don't know, teach them. try to guide them in a way that is
Yeah,
humble and open
Because-
to correction ultimately. Because, I mean, look, it's good to have an authority whose decisions and beliefs can be, revised. And just because the Pope is infallible under certain circumstances does not mean that he will always have an answer under for every problem.
right.
But it does mean that he is often a source of wisdom, of tremendous wisdom, and you do owe him a fair amount of
Yeah.
assent.
And the purpose of infallibility is to act as a final arbiter for
Mhm.
debate, for theological debate. And
Would-
because of that, there's an exceptional nature to it.
Mhm.
It's by its very nature, just like ecumenical councils are by their very nature exceptional in church history. You only have one, in some cases every few centuries.
Yeah.
Papal infallibility serves that similar exceptional, and so just because the Pope is saying something to the whole church, it's not at all apparent that
Yeah.
he's intending to bind the entire church to this as
Yes.
something divinely revealed.
And canon law.
Can I talk
says-
about Vatican II itself and the controversies from Vatican II?
Would it be all right if I read what Ludwig Ott says?
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, okay. For the proper understanding of the dogma, the following points must be noted. By the way, this is section 8.1, page 307 in my edition. The bearer of infallibility is every lawful pope as successor of Peter, the prince of the apostles. But the pope alone is infallible, not others to whom he transfers a part of his teaching authority. For instance, the Roman congregations. So that's the bearer. The object of infallibility is his teaching concerning faith and morals, above all revealed teaching, but also non-revealed teachings, which are closely associated with the teachings of revelation. So things that follow logically from the deposit of faith. The condition of infallibility is that the Pope speaks ex cathedra. For this is required that he speak as pastor and teacher of all the faithful with the full weight of his supreme apostolic authority. If he speaks as a private theologian or as the bishop of his diocese, he is not infallible. That he have the intention of deciding finally a teaching of faith or morals, so that it is to be held by all the faithful. I mean, that intention has to be made explicit. We can't read his mind. Without this intention, which must be made clear in the formulation or by the circumstances, a decision ex cathedra is not complete. Most of the doctrinal expressions made by the popes in their encyclicals are not decisions ex cathedra. The source of his infallibility is the supernatural assistance of the Holy Spirit, who protects the supreme teacher.
It's important to also guard against another excess here, which is
The
that some
magic
people will read this narrow interpretation and say, okay, well, that means that the only instance of papal infallibility is just the definition of papal infallibility itself, and
like
the-
ineffabilis deus and stuff like that.
and the the Immaculate Conception and the Assumption. That's not what we're saying.
Yeah. So let me read what the part of Ordinatio Sacerdotalis, which is John Paul II's statement on women priests, that they can never be priests. Based! Sorry.
Yeah.
Wherefore, in order that all doubt may be removed regarding a matter of great importance, a matter which pertains to the Church's divine constitution itself, in virtue of our ministry of confirming the brethren, we declare that the Church has no authority whatsoever to confer priestly ordination on women, and that this judgment is to be definitively held by all the Church's faithful. See, this does not follow any particular rubric, but it does meet the conditions, because it is a pope binding the entire church to a judgment or belief, definitively held by all the church's faithful. That pertains to the full assent of faith. So the pope cannot bind explicitly the whole church to error. He can certainly set forth errors, and in those cases, we should humbly, present our concerns. Obviously we shouldn't be douches about it, and we should definitely give what has been promulgated the benefit of the doubt and try really, 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 really hard to reconcile it with tradition. But in some
Yeah.
cases, that's not possible.
And
But
there
I
are, of
figured I'd
course,
say.
other instances through church history. There's, I think, Pius IX's Canticora.
Quanta
Is-
Cura, yeah.
Yeah, well, let me just read that. He says, therefore, by our apostolic authority, we reject, proscribe, and condemn all singular and evil opinions and doctrines, doctrines severally mentioned in this letter, and will and command that they be thoroughly held by all the children of the Catholic Church as rejected, proscribed, and condemned.
Yeah. So at the very least, he's infallibly saying that you have to believe that it's rejected, prescribed, and condemned.
And there are other ones. And also, I think Agatho, with his
Exsurge Domine also has that formulation. Based.
So, and I think Boniface VIII, at least in saying that every creature has to be subject to the Roman Pontiff
for salvation.
For salvation. And that's confirmed by Eugene IV.
I'll just say one last thing. Sorry for interrupting you.
Yeah, go ahead.
Obviously, some things are logically equivalent to binding all the faithful. So an anathema, for a certain belief, is logically equivalent because it puts people who do not believe a certain thing outside the church, and therefore it binds all the faithful, perforce by necessity. Right. Because everyone who doesn't believe it is then cursed and kicked out of the church. Right. So that's something logically equivalent. But the point is it does have to be explicit. And so an encyclical can err. It just demands that you give it the benefit of the doubt and try really, really hard to accept it. Interestingly, submission of intellect and will, if you look at Edward Peters' blog, it's not really well understood what you're supposed to do when an encyclical or something like that contradicts tradition.
Basically, what I do is, and this is how I approach Vatican II as well. If there is, particularly Vatican II, because that's an ecumenical council, if there's a passage that seems to contradict prior magisterium, that is, established magisterium, then your job is to hold to the old and try to reconcile the new with the old. If you can't do that, then either you remain in a state of puzzlement and allow that to
Sedevacantism,
but by the church, or if it is, it's outside the scope of infallibility, and there's weightier tradition to contradict the innovation, then you are free to disagree with the innovation. Because
can I say something about this?
Yes.
Yeah.
If you ever look at Father Shikata or the Michael brothers, because they're the two biggest proponents, the Diamond brothers, they're the two biggest proponents vocally on the internet, if not worldwide, on Sedevacantism. Both of them will take extremely radical readings of council documents, which even reading them the most liberally, no one else in the world will read as of them. They'll say they'll read universalism into them, like universal salvation, or they'll read that non-Christian, not even just they'll say it denies there's no salvation outside the church, but even more so, they'll say that non-Christian religions will be means of salvation. And so,
and I've also heard people say that when Vatican II says that man is, in a certain sense, the most prized creation of God, people will say this contradicts the Bible, where it says that he's made a little lower than the angels. And it's like, really? You really think that's what it was trying to say?
It's saying in a certain sense.
In a sense he is, because man is a culmination of the cosmos. The angels are not.
Yeah, and I mean, God sent his only begotten Son to save us. He didn't send them to save the angels who fell. So one thing that the Sedevacantists will say is they'll take, I don't remember which document, but in Vatican II, there's something about how
Subsist.
yes, the Church of
Right.
Jesus
Right.
subsists in the Catholic Church, which they say
This is what Griff Ruby says that this caused the council to defect.
This
right
is an
now.
important point. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's really quite ridiculous because subsist in just means exists in. And so
Entirely. Yeah.
entirely in.
Yeah.
And in fact, that is a more restrictive position
And
in a
here's what
sense
it's
than extra ecclesiam nulla salus.
Right.
Because saying that, the body of the faith, that the true church exists in fully in
Keep
the
in
Catholic.
mind that
And
Benedict
here's another
XVI
thing about it.
clarified
Yeah.
this reading of the document. That's his reading of the document.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Go on. Classical Fiesta.
Yeah. Here's another important point. When it says that the true church subsists in the Catholic Church, the reason it's saying that it's dealing with the aspects of sanctifying grace that are present outside of the visible walls of the church. And one of those that we all recognize, even Sedevacantism recognizes, many Protestant baptisms. Okay? The Protestant baptism, what Vatican II is saying, and with respect to that, their baptisms are Catholic baptisms. They belong to the church. And it uses this language of belonging to the Catholic Church. Those presence of sanctification may be outside the visible, and this is why there's the appearance of a distinction between the church and the Catholic Church. It's by Catholic Church, it's meaning the visible structure. Now, it's not saying that those are separable because the true church subsists entirely in the visible structure. Nevertheless, the church's jurisdiction can be present even outside of those visible structures, and that's evidenced by the existence of valid Protestant baptisms. Those baptisms are the Catholic Church's baptisms.
Yes, any child baptized into the Protestant faith who then dies before the age of reason goes to heaven. Because everyone
they're
who is
sons and
baptized,
daughters of the Catholic Church.
Everyone who is baptized is sort of a citizen of the Catholic Church by birth, and then they can renounce that citizenship at a certain point, but they're still citizens.
So in a certain sense, that makes it more based.
Yes, it's actually much more restrictive in many respects. Another thing they'll say is like, well, it says Protestants aren't denied a role in the mystery of salvation. So I have two responses to that. One, there's your point about baptism. Then there's my point, which is, yeah, they have a role. They're the villains. Sorry about that.
But yeah, I mean, like, if we want to be maybe a little realistic about it, I don't think that's a unrealistic aspect of it, though. But perhaps another aspect would just be the fact that someone raised as a Protestant might very well be more disposed to the reception of the Catholic faith than someone raised a Hindu. Okay,
I mean that's
and in a sense
undeniably true.
That is a means by which sanctification can be mediated. They become an instrumental cause, despite themselves.
Yeah. The most problematic document is Dignitatis Humanae, by all accounts, which talks about the right to religious freedom. I don't think we really. I mean, Classical Theist has a video trying to reconcile them using Arthur Pink's
one important
position.
part of it, though, is that in a certain way, the only way that we can deal with certain documents which pertain to disallowing Catholics from infringing upon the rights of non-Christian religious minorities. I'm thinking of Gregory IX, the whole secret Judaism non policy.
Yeah.
That does presuppose that the church's right to coerce religiously does not extend outside the baptized.
Which that is a sensible position. I mean,
And because of that, the argument from Thomas Pink is that the church in Dignitatis Humanae is addressing secular states. And
yes,
secular states by nature are severed from union with the church. Now, Vatican II is not denying here. I mean, of course, many people who drafted it would have denied it, but the text itself, and I'm not saying the text is good. The text is very
problematic.
Yeah, it's not something that I like. But as to the text itself, what it's saying is the church's right to coerce religiously only comes from herself. And the state can only assist in that religious coercion in the measure that it is an instrument of the church.
And I will say, Dignitatis Humanae doesn't have the liberal concept of religious freedom because it still does support religious persecution in service of natural law and social order.
Right. Yeah. To protect the public order. And so once the church is severed from the state and the state is just itself in disharmony with the church, we can read one of the motives of Dignitatis Humanae as a way of protecting the church's rights.
Yeah.
That the state doesn't have of itself the power to coerce religiously. And in a way we can celebrate that if the state is hostile to the church.
Yeah, I can keep in mind, firstly, Vatican II says nothing in here is infallible unless explicitly said so. And there's not only are there no anathemas in Dignitatis Humanae, there aren't even any theological censures.
And if I could finish this point.
Yeah, sorry.
No, sorry. I don't mean. But if we conceive of a situation where the church and the state are united, do we have any post-Vatican II magisterial data to justify a Christendom structure where the church does impose legal restrictions pertaining to religion? Well, yes. The 1982 Code of Canon Law actually says, it affirms that the church has a right to coerce, to use means of coercion on the baptized to fulfill their baptismal promises. That's in 1982 Code of Canon Law. So, if we're thinking of what are those means of coercion, implicit in that is the allowability for the state to assist in that. If you have sort of the soul-body union of the church and state in play. We don't right now, so. But, people might say this Thomas Pink interpretation is a bit of a stretch. Maybe it is. But as Tyrillian said, we're dealing with a very low level of magisterial weight anyway.
Yeah, and as Serpkerp and I discussed in our last video, I mean, the idea that pastoral councils have never occurred and that it's just like a massive cope that we've invented to deal with Vatican II, that's not true. Many councils never accomplished anything.
Right.
Like I believe the Second Lateran. Oh yeah, well the Second Lateran Council said we're going to excommunicate Christians who use archery in wars against one another.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
that one's one of my favorite. I mean, they rescinded that one.
It's so absurd.
They rescinded that one really quickly. It was really quite funny.
Can I get back to Dignitatis Humanae? Can the prior teaching? I mean, I adhere to it, but can the teaching of Pius XI and was it Gregory IX and Leo XIII? That's not necessarily infallible anyway. So even if Dignitatis Humanae, from my understanding, was infallible, that wouldn't cause a contradiction. Neither of them are infallible. There's no contradiction of two infallibilities.
I would have to read stuff like Quanto Cura again.
What Quanta Cura is concerned with is the church's rights.
Yeah.
So the church's rights not to be.
Well, keep in mind that
state.
Dignitatis Humanae led to the collapse of corporatist Portugal and Francoist Spain.
Yeah, so I mean, it was
led to the collapse of both of those governments.
I mean, it was bad. Like, it did have very negative effects. We shouldn't deny that.
I think, though, that while, the syllabus of errors, we might not say is itself, I think Quanta Cura is infallible, but the syllabus of errors may not be infallible. Of itself, it's of weightier value than Dignitatis Humanae. So, I mean, we could just defer to that anyway.
Yeah.
And there's a whole tradition of papal, this particularly 19th century, early 20th century papal teaching on the relationship between the church and the state that is so organically linked with the past millennia of the church. It's a development from earlier centuries, but it's an organic outgrowth of what came before. That we can just defer to that, and we, if Vatican II, if Dignitatis Humanae might sort of go against that, that's.
I mean, you could argue.
No, the reason I said that statement specifically is that Sedevacantists, they'll say that, well, they'll quote Christ and they'll point to judge it by its fruits, and they'll say the new mass and so on and so forth is a clear defection from Catholicism. But if you try to make them point where there's this deficiency, this smoking gun, they have no point where they can see that there was a promulgation. Like, it's not night and day. You get to the point where you have somebody like Bishop Sanborn will just quote hearsay conspiratorial evidence.
Yeah.
And say that John the 23rd isn't a pope.
He was a Mason. How do you know he was a Mason?
The most transparent or clear defection you could point to is in Dignitatis Humanae. And it's not, and as I said, even in like the most charitable or extreme, it's not an infallible statement.
Right.
Yeah.
Like, going back to what you said about John the 23rd and Mason, the Diamond Brothers, for example, they go to such ridiculous extremes with the conspiratorial stuff.
Can I quote it?
Yeah.
Can I quote their video? And why is Paul VI so obsessed with black magic? Because he used it to convince the world that he was a pope.
They flipped Paul VI's signature upside down and said that it's the mark of the beast in Revelation.
They're so funny.
It's like, yeah, he needed to use black magic to convince them that he was, not the fact that he like walked out of St. Peter's balcony in the papal tiara.
I mean, whatever you might say about Paul VI, he didn't need to use black magic to convince the world that he was a pope.
Yeah.
As a Sedevacantist, I don't know where like Paul VI stops being a pope. I don't know what to tell you. It's just I went to a Novus Ordo church and I saw lesbians kissing in front of me, and that was really disgusting. And now I like going to the Sedevacantist church because I don't see stuff like that.
Well, I mean, let's be honest. I mean, in the medieval period, as has been observed, sometimes you had people bringing their animals with them into church. Like
Pius V, I think, talked about what to do if a monkey steals a Eucharist host during consecration.
So we're talking. So was he talking about atheist Eucharistic desecration?
Makes me think of that video game where you can play as a monkey and people kept saying it was an atheism simulator. I'm so sorry, guys.
No, that's fine.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of problems that haven't been addressed that could have been addressed by Vatican II, just as there was a lot of problems that led to the Protestant Reformation that could have been addressed by Lateran V.
Oh
Yeah.
yeah.
I mean, Paul XII opened the door to throwing out the Comma Johanneum, right?
Wait. You mean Pius XII?
Pius XII.
Yeah, so Pius XII was actually an innovator, as Serp and I discussed in our last
There's
video.
no denying that.
Pius XII allowed critical historical study of the Bible. He allowed widespread adherence to evolution and its compatibility with Catholicism. He got rid
and there's
of.
also his liturgical innovations.
Well, he began the liturgical innovations. The original planning stages for Vatican II were under him.
I mean, there's also the obvious fact that all the council fathers, to a large extent, came from him.
The fasting, the cut down on fasting, and Saturday night or Saturday evening widespread masses began under him, and he got rid of the papal. So if you start out with Pius XII getting rid of
Papal nobility.
Papal nobility, and then it ends with John Paul I being inaugurated.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's a clear trajectory.
Yeah.
Of the decline of the papacy viewing itself as a monarchy.
Oh, that feel with no black nobility anymore. Why even live? Guess I'm gonna become a Hindu now.
I want to say one more thing.
Yeah.
Mhm.
If you can't prove that John the 23rd wasn't Pope in any other way than just knee-jerk saying he was a Mason because conspiracy theory, then wouldn't John Paul I be the Pope because he would have never done anything to defect from the faith, and there would have been valid cardinals appointed by Pius XII?
Yeah.
It's something that always I found hilarious.
Another problem with that is the fact that, I mean, just look back at the Renaissance. I mean, there's, I mean, if we depose John the 23rd just because of suspicions of Masonry, I mean, do we really have that much assurance that some of the Renaissance popes weren't dabbling into some of the esoteric cult literature that was prevalent at the time?
Speaking of the Renaissance, should we mention Cum Ex Apostolica?
Yeah, that can be one of the last things that's a very
by Paul
important
IV.
topic. Yeah.
You might want to explain what it is.
Yeah, so it's this. Of course, well, you want to go into some of the historical background about Paul.
Okay, so Paul IV was really, really paranoid. Understandably, this was at the height of the Reformation, and he was terrified that that his potential successor would be a Protestant. The guy who was considered the front runner for his papacy, he believed, I don't know how credible it was, but he strongly believed that he might be a crypto Protestant. And so he promulgated a bull to deal with that. And I guess you can explain it now, CT.
Yeah, where the main issue is dealing, and by the way, we should note that this bull is disciplinary. This is not a doctrinal, and this is affirmed by Cardinal Fessler, who was very integral in drafting the papal infallibility dogma.
Nah, man, Cardinal Fessler believed that everything the Pope said was infallible.
Yeah,
Watch Dyer. Watch Dyer.
Watch Jay Dyer tell.
No, go on.
But yeah, so I don't have it in front of me. I don't think it makes much sense to go hunt it down. But the gist of it is that if a pope if a cardinal is a heretic, is suspected of heresy or was a heretic, and is elected, then his election is to be considered null and
yeah.
So I mean, we can just look at that from by reason, and we can say that's unjust and absurd. We can also look at the fact that that precedent was not followed by later popes.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I mean, who has to suspect him to be a heretic? It's never really clearly defined.
Yeah, and it would also put us in. We would have no assurance whatsoever the papacy at all, because
Yeah.
if someone is an occult heretic, then that would mean that his election wasn't valid. But he would know faith have no assurance of the papacy at all. And canon law, the law that determined papal elections, it never quotes Paul IV on these points. It never says that. It talks about how, you know, a pope, how a bishop might lose their office if they are defective from the faith. And defective from the faith in that case means they join religion, or they're evidently not Catholic.
I mean, you
But
can't quote conspiracy theories on this. You have to go.
right, yeah.
You need to do a bit more homework than that.
And there's also the fact that when we're talking about, so let's just take for the sake of argument that Cum Ex Apostolatus Officio is valid today. To be suspected of heresy, that's a juridical process. Or to be deemed a heretic in the past, present, or future, that's a juridical process exercised by the church, not by laymen.
Yeah, it's not something that that the Diamond Brothers
That Most Holy
decide.
Family Monastery can resolve.
Nah, man, they're gonna be the two witnesses mentioned in Revelation.
Yeah, Enoch and Elisha.
To Jesus through the diamond.
Does anyone want to say anything before we close this up? I want to close it up with a prayer.
Yeah, sure. Well, let's. I don't have any. Do you have any
final statements? Or?
I have one.
Yeah.
It's about why certain Sedevacantists are such. So I'm sure a lot of people, and you can stop me if you think that this is unwise to talk about, but there is an extreme lack of charity in Sedevacantism.
Yes.
Now, of course, I do want to distinguish dogmatic Sedevacantists, the ones who believe you're going to hell if you're not a Sedevacantist, versus people who have just been so scandalized that they are Sedevacantists. Completely different territory. But anyway, there's an extreme lack of charity, and it's actually quite easy to explain because their entire worldview depends on the idea that it's completely obvious that the Pope is deposed. Sedevacantism hinges on the idea that A, it's obvious that these popes were heretics, B, it's obvious that they were deposed by that heresy. And because of that, because they treat that as axiomatic, they're incapable of seeing any disagreement as being in good faith. And so that's why there's such a tremendous lack of charity. It's not an accident. It's kind of inherent to the system and to their epistemology.
People that are naturally jerks, if they're going to choose a religion, they choose a religion where it's a small group of faithful against,
them against the world.
Oh yeah,
that's why Calvinists or like jerks often choose to be Calvinists, and
oh yeah,
version of that is.
I have one last statement to make, and that's one of the arguments that I use against the traditional Sedevacantist line of thinking, that the Pope loses his office automatically by virtue of a heresy. One of the problems I have with that is that it cuts into the efficacy of papal infallibility as such, to me. And that's because, like, okay, let's say that we are at the time of Pius IX, and he is promulgating the dogma concerning the Immaculate Conception. Okay, let's say that you and don't focus on the example itself, because that's not so much important, but is what it let's say that you're of the opinion that it contradicts Scripture. And this was an allowable position to
Yeah.
until that point. And you determined that it's manifestly contrary to Scripture. And so, upon the Pope's promulgation of this dogma, in your judgment, that would be his deposition. Because you have determined that this is heretical, so that if he affirms this heresy in your mind, then that does not command your conscience to conform to his teaching. On the other hand, it invalidates his papacy.
Well, you know what example is actually also poignant? The definition of papal infallibility itself.
Yeah, that's true.
The old Catholics who split from Rome because they were like, "Hey, we don't believe in fallibility."
So the important point.
If you look into the history of Sedevacantism, you'll find something creeping on over and over again. A very gray area between independent or old Catholics and Sedevacantists, especially in holy orders.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
For instance, Pope Michael is ordained in old Catholic holy orders, which he bought.
Wow.
It can be hearsay that he bought, essentially.
I think a more realistic example, as opposed to the Immaculate Conception, would be one that actually happened, which was the whole spiritualist controversy with John the 22nd.
Yeah, and then William of Ockham was like...
William of Ockham believed that this was belonging to the deposit of faith, the idea that,
apostolic poverty.
Yeah, the idea that the apostles and Christ did not own anything. So he was convinced that was the deposit of faith, and so when John the 22nd came down on them, condemned them as heretical, they just turned it back around on him and said, "No, you're heretical." And the problem is that this sedevacantist theory that will always allow that for the layman to, in his private judgment, be shielded from papal infallibility and papal jurisdiction on doctrinal matters, because you can just determine that because you have independently looked into this, that the Pope has committed heresy, and so it renders impotent papal heresy.
I mean, it's kind of the reason vigilantism is wrong.
Yeah. Okay, well, that's all I have to say.
Yeah. So let's end this with a prayer. You want to lead, Serp?
Yes. Saint Michael the Archangel, defend us in battle. Be our protection against the malice and snares of the devil. May God rebuke him, we humbly pray. O do you, O Prince of the heavenly host, by divine power, thrust into hell Satan and all the evil spirits who prowl about the world, seeking the ruin of souls. Amen.
Amen. All right.
GG.